Imagine stumbling into the strangest graveyard on Earth. No stone markers, no marble angels, just layer upon layer of massive bones. So many that every step crunches under your feet. And these aren't dinosaurs, or mammoths, or anything you've seen in a museum gift shop. This is a cemetery of sloths. But not the tree-hugging, slow-motion little guys we know today. These were giant sloths the size of elephants. And the way they died, let's just say, if there were a prehistoric version of the Darwin Awards, this herd just won first place. When we usually think of fossils, the images are brutal. Saber-toothed cats tearing into prey, raptors fighting each other to the death, or entire species wiped out in the blink of an asteroid. Death in the fossil record often feels cinematic, tragic, even noble. But nature doesn't always work that way. Sometimes it's absurd. Sometimes it's the kind of ridiculous that makes scientists shake their heads and laugh before they realize, no, this actually happened. That's what this story is about, not the epic deaths, but the weird ones. Deaths so random and so bizarre that you can't help but wonder, how on earth did that happen? And there's no better place to begin than a patch of land in southwest Ecuador called Tanque Loma. Because here, about 20,000 years ago, dozens of these elephant-sized sloths met their end together, in one of the most humiliating and bizarre ways imaginable. Let's set the scene. The victims were Eremotherium, a prehistoric cousin of today's sloth, but erased the image of a sleepy little animal dangling from a branch. These things were monsters. They weighed up to 4.5 tons, stood 3 times taller than a human, and stretched 20 feet from nose to tail. Their bones were so thick and heavy that their skeletons looked more like those of elephants than sloths. They were, in every sense of the word, beasts. And yet, despite their size, dozens of them ended up piled together here in a prehistoric mass grave. So how could something so big, so tough, fall in such numbers all at once? At first, the answer seemed obvious. The La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles had already taught us how deadly natural asphalt can be. Step into the wrong patch of sticky goo and you're trapped, sinking inch by inch until the tar swallows you whole. And Tanque Loma had asphalt too. So the first idea was simple. These sloths walked into a tar trap and never came out. But the evidence didn't quite match. At La Brea, skeletons are completely encased, perfectly preserved in asphalt. At Tanque Loma, the tar only covered parts of the bones. Some were only lightly coated, some not at all. The deaths didn't look like classic tar victims. Something else was at play. The answer came when scientists dug deeper and uncovered something far stranger and far smellier. The bones weren't lying in plain soil. They were buried in a thick, organic layer made of digested plants. At first, it looked like decayed vegetation. But soon, the truth became unavoidable. This wasn't just plants. It was feces. Fossilized sloth feces. Tons and tons of it. Enough to cover an entire herd. In fact, estimates suggest more than 80 tons of sloth droppings surrounded the remains. Yes, you heard that right. These colossal sloths were buried in poop. And it wasn't random. It was their own. So how does something like this kill a herd? The theory goes like this. During a drought, the sloths crowded into a shallow pool that still had water and plants. At first, it was Paradisea refuge in harsh times. But sloths, like most animals, weren't exactly concerned about sanitation. They ate there. They drank there. And, well, they relieved themselves there. Over time, layer upon layer of feces turned the pool into a festering soup of bacteria, parasites, and pathogens, and the sloths kept coming back to drink from it, wallow in it, and live in it, until eventually, the very water that saved them became poison. They died not of predators or starvation, but of their own waste. Now, this sounds like the kind of weird story scientists might dream up after one too many late nights. But it actually has a modern precedent. In the 1970s, during a severe drought in Tanzania, a herd of about 140 hippos crowded into a shrinking pool. Within weeks, their collective waste transformed the water into a toxic stew. By the end, More than 100 of them were dead from disease and poisoning. Nature had created a septic trap, and the hippos walked right into it. The same scenario, paleontologists argue, played out thousands of years earlier in Ecuador only this time. It was sloths. Picture it for a moment. A parched valley. Shaggy, elephant-sized sloths lumbering down to the only water for miles. At first, they find relief. They drink. They splash. They cool off. But slowly, the water darkens. The smell grows unbearable. The pool becomes less an oasis and more an open sewer. Yet the sloths keep returning, because there's nowhere else to go. One by one, they grow weak, sick, and collapse. Jeff Goldblum once said in Jurassic Park, "That is one big pile of," well, you know the line. For these sloths, it was more than a punchline. It was their coffin. And so, Tanque Loma became the final resting place of dozens of prehistoric giants. Not felled by predators or cataclysms, but by microbes in a cesspool of their own making. It's easy to laugh, and honestly, how can you not? A 4-ton sloth brought down by dirty water sounds like something straight out of dark comedy. But Tanque Loma is also a reminder of how fragile life really is. Even the mightiest creatures can fall, not to tooth and claw, but to bacteria too small to see. For us, it's also a reminder to be grateful for things we take for granted: plumbing, sanitation, and the fact that our drinking water doesn't double as our toilet. And if you think this is the weirdest way nature has ever pulled the plug, think again. Because if giant sloths died in the world's biggest prehistoric porta potty, the next story is about frogs who perished in a swamp, not from disease, not from predators, but from something much stranger. They drowned in the chaos of their own love lives. If the story of the giant sloths was tragic in its absurdity, the next tale is, well, honestly, it's kind of hilarious. At least until you picture it up close. It takes us not to the steaming jungles of South America, but to a cooler, swampy corner of what is now Germany. 45 million years ago, this land wasn't filled with beer gardens and autobahns. It was a vast swamp. Lush, humid, teeming with life. And in this swamp, hundreds of frogs came together and died. At first glance, nothing about their fossils seems unusual. The skeletons are small, delicate, neatly preserved. They weren't mangled. They weren't diseased. And they weren't chewed on by predators. In fact, they look almost peaceful, as if one day they simply stopped hopping in frozen time. And yet there are so many of them. Layer after layer of tiny amphibians stacked like a mass grave. For decades, paleontologists puzzled over this strange graveyard. Why would so many frogs die in one place? All apparently healthy, with no evidence of trauma? The usual explanations fell short. Disease leaves signs in bone, but none were found. Predators leave bite marks, but the fossils were pristine. Even the idea of a drought didn't make sense, because the surrounding area still had plenty of wetlands. This wasn't an isolated puddle drying up. This was a thriving swamp. So why the frog apocalypse? For years, the Geiseltal frogs were considered an unsolvable mystery. Textbooks literally shrugged their pages and said, "We don't know." But then, in recent years, paleontologists took a different approach. Instead of just studying fossils, they started watching living frogs. And what they saw made everything click into place. Here's the key for many frogs. Love is not only exhausting, it's dangerous. Modern herpetologists know that during mating season, frogs enter a frenzy. Dozens of males pile onto females in a desperate scramble to reproduce. It's messy, chaotic, and not exactly gentle. Scientists even have a term for it: amplexus, a polite Latin word that basically means the frog dog pile. Now here's the dark twist. In the chaos of these frenzied frog orgies, many females get pushed under the water. They're not Olympic swimmers to begin with, and once pinned beneath a mass of overexcited suitors, they can't breathe. Some die mid-mating. Others die from sheer exhaustion. Either way, love becomes lethal. Sound ridiculous? It happens all the time. Even today, in wetlands across the world, herpetologists observe female frogs floating lifelessly after being literally loved to death. In some species, up to 10% of females perish this way each season. It's grim, it's sad, and it's also exactly what seems to have happened 45 million years ago in Geiseltal. The evidence fits perfectly. These fossil frogs were members of the family Pelobatidae spadefoot toads and their relatives. They lived most of their lives on land, only returning to water during the brief, explosive breeding season, which meant they weren't great swimmers. Combine that with a swamp crowded with eager males, and suddenly, the cause of death is obvious. The Geiseltal graveyard isn't the result of plague or predators. It's the result of frogs literally drowning in passion. Pause for a moment and let that sink in. Hundreds of fossil frogs, entombed forever in stone, because their love lives got too rowdy. If the sloths of Tanque Loma gave us death by toilet, then Geiseltal gives us death by romance. Tragic, yes, but also undeniably weird. Now, if this all sounds like the kind of bizarre footnote you'd expect to find in some obscure biology journal, let me remind you it's still happening today. Amphibians worldwide are struggling, not just from their own reckless love lives, but from human activity, habitat destruction, and, most devastating of all, a fungal pandemic called chytrid fungus. Entire species have been wiped out in just decades. In Ecuador alone, more than 170 frog species have vanished. For many, the last survivors may have died not in a swamp orgy, but quietly in captivity, waiting for conservationists to intervene. So the Geiseltal frogs tell us two things. First, that bizarre mass deaths aren't just ancient quirks theory part of the long, messy history of life on Earth. And second, that fragility continues today. These little amphibians, whether in fossil beds or in modern streams, remind us how quickly abundance can collapse into silence. But let's not end this chapter on a completely somber note. After all, there's a strange humor in this story too. The idea that love, in all its chaotic, exhausting glory, has always carried risks even in the swampy heart of prehistoric Europe. Humans write poems about passion, compose songs about heartbreak. Frogs? They just went all in and sometimes never came back up. And so, the mystery of the Geiseltal frogs is solved. Not disease, not drought, but love too much love. It's tragic. It's darkly funny. And it's a reminder that nature doesn't always write its stories with dignity. Sometimes, it prefers slapstick. And speaking of slapstick, if you thought frogs drowning during their mating season was absurd, wait until you meet a flying reptile whose cause of death wasn't a predator, or a storm, or even an asteroid. Not his poor creature died because it flew straight into a plant. And the plant won. When you think of prehistoric killers, you probably imagine claws, teeth, or maybe a 6-mile-wide rock from space. But sometimes, the deadliest weapon in nature's arsenal is a houseplant. And that's not a joke. One of the strangest fossil deaths ever recorded belongs to a flying reptile, a pterosaur, that managed to lose a fight to a leaf. This story begins in early Cretaceous Brazil, about 110 million years ago. The skies above what is now South America weren't empty, they buzzed with wingspans that stretched across the horizon. Among them was a pterosaur called Lotodactylus. If you grew up with toy pterodactyls, you already know the general image: a long, pointed beak filled with sharp teeth, wings stretched wide, soaring above ancient lagoons. Except Lotodactylus was real. It had a wingspan of about 13 feet and a mouth lined with jagged, interlocking teeth that screamed, "Fish eater." This was not a vegetarian. This was a sky hunter, which is why paleontologists were floored when they uncovered a fossil of Lotodactylus that looked, frankly, ridiculous. Sticking right through its lower jaw was a long, sharp, rigid object. At first glance, it looked like the animal had been impaled, but not by another creature, by a plant, specifically, the leaf of a yucca. Now, if you've ever brushed past a yucca, or one of its cousins nicknamed Spanish bayonet, you know those leaves are no joke. They're stiff, needle-like, and sharp enough to puncture skin. Gardeners in the Southwest still end up in the ER thanks to yucca leaves. They're basically nature's lances, disguised as landscaping. And apparently, One unlucky pterosaur found that out the hard way. Picture it, Lithodactylus soaring low, scanning for fish. Maybe the wind shifts. Maybe its aim is off. And suddenly it collides with a yucca. The plant's leaf drives straight through the thin skin of its lower jaw. Not enough to kill instantly, but enough to cripple. Imagine trying to eat, to drink, with a foot-long thorn stuck in your mouth. Impossible. That's exactly what paleontologists believe happened. The yucca leaf became lodged in the jaw. The wound festered. Infection spread, and the animal starved or dehydrated. Slowly, painfully. Not a glorious death in battle. Not a cinematic plunge into a predator's jaws, just days of agony thanks to a plant. And here's the kicker. This isn't just speculation. The fossil itself preserves the leaf still jammed into the jawbone. 110 million years later, the smoking gun is still there. It's the prehistoric equivalent of a crime scene photo. And the culprit is a shrub. There's a dark comedy here that's hard to ignore. We think of pterosaurs as apex flyers, kings of the air, swooping down on prey with precision. Yet this one met its end the way you might if you tripped face first into your mom's cactus collection. It's like choking on a Dorito. But the Dorito is alive, sharp as a sword, and refuses to leave your mouth. And if you think this is a one-off, think again. Plants, as it turns out, can be surprisingly murderous. The Yucca pterosaur isn't the only fossil case where vegetation turned deadly. Another comes from North Dakota's Tanis site, where a turtle was found literally skewered by a tree branch guild in the chaos of the asteroid impact. And if you expand your view to modern times, sharp plants still rack up injuries. Just ask any landscaper who's tangled with an agave or a thorn bush. Mother Nature doesn't always need claws. Sometimes, a well-placed spike will do. But the Yucca pterosaur is special because it's the only known case where a plant directly killed a flying reptile. And we still have the body as proof. That fossil, with its leaf still embedded, is a permanent reminder that in the wild, sometimes the most unexpected hazards are the deadliest. There's something almost human in the absurdity of it. We love to imagine ourselves as masters of our environment, only to trip over coffee tables or stub toes on door frames. This pterosaur was no different. Apex predator or not. One bad encounter with a yucca leaf, and everything falls apart. So next time you walk past a spiky houseplant, give it a little respect. Because once upon a time, a flying reptile with a 13-foot wingspan lost its life to one. And if you think being impaled by a plant is bizarre, wait until you hear about what happened when an asteroid hit Earth. Because 3,000 miles from ground zero, creatures were still dying in ways so strange. They sound like science fiction. Fish choking on molten glass, turtles run through by trees, and dinosaurs crushed by waves taller than skyscrapers. This isn't a disaster movie, it's the real fossil record. 66 million years ago, the world woke up to a bad day. Not just a bad day for one herd of animals, or even one continent. A bad day for the entire planet. This was the day the asteroid hit. The one that erased the dinosaurs, darkened the skies, and reshaped life on Earth forever. We know the broad strokes. A rock the size of a city slammed into what's now the Yucatan Peninsula, unleashing more energy than every nuclear weapon on Earth combined. Instant devastation at ground zero. Firestorms, earthquakes, tidal waves, a global winter. But as apocalyptic as that sounds, the most haunting part isn't the big picture. It's the small, local snapshots, moments of death frozen in stone. And nowhere is that clearer than in a fossil site in North Dakota called Tanis. Now, Tanis is about 3,000 kilometers, almost 2,000 miles from the impact crater. That's like an explosion in Houston killing everything in New York. You'd think life that far away would have been safe. But the fossils tell a different story. Because at Tanis, death came in strange, almost surreal forms. Let's start with the fish. Paleontologists uncovered dozens of them, preserved in exquisite detail. Their gills, packed with tiny glass beads. Not pearls, not sand, but microtectite molten droplets of rock blasted into the atmosphere when the asteroid hit, cooled into glass as they rained back down. These fish didn't die peacefully. They suffocated as they inhaled a storm of molten debris falling from the sky. Imagine breathing in glass shrapnel, and you get the picture. And they weren't alone. Mixed in with the fish are freshwater and saltwater species, crammed together in places they shouldn't be. How do ocean creatures end up fossilized in the middle of North Dakota? The answer is waves. Not gentle ripples, but violent seiche waves triggered by the impact. Picture a giant lake sloshing like a bathtub, except the waves towered 100 meters 300 feet high. They swept animals miles inland, tossing them together in a chaotic blender of mud, water, and death. Then there's the turtle. Paleontologists found one fossilized with a tree branch speared clean through its shell. Not a predator. Not disease, just the sheer bad luck of being in the wrong place as forests were ripped apart and hurled like javelins. One instant you're swimming peacefully. The next, you're shish kebab. And it gets stranger. Insect burrows, probably ant nests, were discovered packed with the same glassy debris, suggesting even underground life wasn't spared. In some cases, dinosaur remains appear to have been crushed and mangled by the waves, preserved three-dimensionally instead of flattened. Most fossils lie pressed like pancakes. But here, the violence of the burial left bodies entombed in lifelike poses, as if frozen mid-struggle. It's haunting. What's remarkable about Tanis isn't just the brutality, but the timing. These fossils appear to capture the very first hours after impact. Not days, not weeks, hours. The asteroid slammed into Mexico. The shockwaves rippled across the planet. And by the time debris rained down, creatures here were already dying. It's as close as we'll ever get to a snapshot of the day the dinosaurs' reign ended. And when you picture it, it's almost cinematic. A sunny Cretaceous afternoon in what would one day be the American Midwest. Fish darting in streams, turtles basking, maybe even a small dinosaur or two foraging on the banks. Then, the ground shakes. The water heaves. The sky darkens. Within minutes, molten glass begins to fall like deadly hail. The waves come crashing in, carrying saltwater fish inland, slamming them against freshwater species. Trees topple, impaling turtles. Ash chokes the air. By sunset, the world is unrecognizable. Standing in the middle of the Tanis site today, you can almost hear the chaos. The fossils are piled in jumbled heaps, bones tangled together, as if nature herself dumped a box of toys and walked away. It's violent, eerie, and strangely intimate. Because while the Chicxulub impact was a global catastrophe, Tanis shows us the personal side, the small, random, ugly ways life ended far from the crater. And here's what makes it resonate. Tanis wasn't anywhere near ground zero. It was thousands of miles away. If devastation this bizarre happened that far out, imagine what the epicenter must have looked like. The asteroid didn't just kill the dinosaurs. It rewrote the entire script of Earth. Mammals, once small and overlooked, got their shot because of days like this. Without Tanis, without Chicxulub, we wouldn't be here telling the story. Now, you might think, well, that's about as strange and catastrophic as it gets. But hold that thought, because our next chapter isn't about cosmic destruction. It's about something much closer to home. Volcanoes. Specifically, one that turned a 2-ton rhinoceros into something that looked less like a fossil and more like a microwave experiment gone wrong. Volcanoes are some of the most awe-inspiring forces on Earth. They build mountains, shape landscapes, and at times, erase everything in their path. We know them today from terrifying eruptions like Mount Vesuvius, Mount St. Helens, or the explosive violence of Krakatoa. But if you think modern eruptions are scary, imagine facing one without warning, without technology, without even the knowledge that such a thing could happen. That's exactly what one unfortunate rhinoceros did in prehistoric Turkey. And the result? Let's just say, it didn't end well. The fossil in question was discovered in Cappadocia, a region famous today for its surreal landscapes, jagged cliffs, fairy chimneys, cave houses, and hot air balloons drifting across the horizon. But millions of years ago, that picturesque landscape was being born in fire. The region was dominated by 3 massive volcanoes. And when they blew, They spewed enough ash and lava to bury valleys and carve out the strange formations we admire today. Somewhere in that ancient chaos lived a rhinoceros. Not the exact species we know today, but a close Cassina member of the genus Stephanorhinus. Smaller than a modern white rhino, but still hefty, weighing in at more than 2 tons. A tank on 4 legs. You'd think such a beast could handle just about anything. But when the volcano erupted, size and strength didn't matter. Nature rolled the dice, and the rhino lost. The fossil itself tells the story. Paleontologists unearthed the skull in 2012, and at first glance, it looked well-preserved, even pristine. But a closer look revealed a horror show. The surface of the skull was rough, corrugated, almost charred. The teeth inside were brittle, cracked, and crumbly, as if they'd been baked in an oven. That was the clue. This rhino hadn't just died, it had been cooked. The evidence pointed to a pyroclastic flow. For anyone lucky enough never to have witnessed one, a pyroclastic flow is a fast-moving avalanche of gas, ash, and volcanic rock. It can reach temperatures over 750 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cook flesh instantly, and it moves faster than a car on the highway. Nothing outruns it. When Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, it was pyroclastic flows that killed the citizens of Pompeii and Herculaneum, burying them in burning ash before they even knew what hit them. For our Cappadocian rhino, the same thing happened, except on an open plain, with nowhere to hide. The eruption likely began with explosions that rained ash across the land, choking plants and animals alike. Then came the surge, a wall of fire racing downhill, searing everything in its path. The rhino would have been engulfed in seconds. Flesh flash-fried, organs dehydrated, skin scorched. And just when you think it couldn't get worse, the pressure of the surge dismembered its body. That's why only the head survived. The rest was torn apart and lost. It's gruesome. It's tragic. But it's also oddly familiar. Because pyroclastic victims, whether human or rhino, show the same signs: brittle teeth, scorched bone, fractured surfaces. When scientists compared the Cappadocia rhino to Pompeii victims, the parallels were unmistakable. Across millions of years, volcanoes kill the same way. And yet, there's a strange poetry to it. The very eruption that destroyed this rhino also preserved its skull. Without the ash, without the fire, we'd never know it existed. Its death gave us its story. Now, if one roasted rhino seems unlucky, here's the kicker. This wasn't even the only time it happened. In North America, paleontologists uncovered another case of a rhino that met a volcanic end, but this one comes with a bizarre twist. Because instead of just leaving behind a skull, the lava created something even stranger: a cave. A cave shaped like a rhino. So if you thought being roasted alive was bad, wait until you hear about what happens when your entire body becomes a mold in volcanic rock. What's stranger than a fossil? A fossil you can walk into, tucked into the basalt cliffs of central Washington, where wind carves echoes through coulees and sagebrush shivers under big western skies. There's a void in the rock that looks suspiciously like an animal. Not an accident. Not a trick of shadow. A shape. Barrel chest. For stumpy legs. A neck that thickens toward a blunt head. Tip your head just so, and you can even make out the lopsided silhouette of a horn. It's as if some giant sculptor carved a rhinoceros into the wall, then scooped the rhino out and left the mold behind. Locals call it the Rhino Cave. Geologists know it as a natural cast. Either way, it's one of those places that makes you grin before the science even starts. Because the first thought that hits you isn't technical. It's childlike. Wait, you're telling me there's a fossil that's also a cave? To understand how a rhino becomes negative space, you have to picture Washington not as it is today: orchards, wind farms, a ribbon of highway hugging the Columbia, but as it was in the Miocene. 15, maybe 16 million years ago. The Northwest threw a lava party and forgot to stop. Basalt poured from giant fissures again and again. Sheet after blazing sheet. Fields of fire ran like rivers, stacked into a plateau thousands of feet thick. It wasn't a volcano with a neat cone. It was the ground itself bleeding flame. And on one of those days, somewhere near a shallow waterhole on a grassy plain. A rhinoceros met its end. Not the African kind you know from nature shows. This was a North American native Eustachii, two-horned brute from a line called Dinosaurs. Picture a hip-high tank with a face like a battering ram. It wallowed when the days were hot, browsed when the wind was cool, and, like heavy creatures do, it liked the easy places, the muddy margins of lakes, the slow bends of streams, the soft ground where a tired body could settle. At some point, heat stroke, disease, a broken limb, bad luck, the rhino died. It rolled and bloated in the way large animals do when the gases of decay turn them into awkward balloons. The legs tucked, the spine arched. Eventually, belly up, it drifted to a shallow spot and snagged. Scavengers came and went. Time slowed to that uneasy quiet that settles over a carcass when the first rush has passed. Then the world to the west began to glow. From beyond the horizon came a low, continuous roar, the sound of a lava flow running downhill. A broad, incandescent tongue creeping across the plain. It was not a sprint. Basalt rarely is. But it was inexorable. Grass hissed to steam. Burrows filled with heat. The air thickened with the smell of hot stone and cooked earth. And forward it came, toward that shallow pool and the floating rhino. When lava hits water, you get a tiny war. The outside of the flow chills and hardens. The inside stays liquid. Pressing forward, steam explodes in bursts, cracking the new crust, letting more lava ooze and seal again. In that stuttering advance, the flow reached the edge of the pool and slid around its cool mirror. Where it touched the rhino, the skin sizzled. But more important than the sizzle was the speed. Water stole heat so quickly from the lava's surface that a shell formed almost instantly. Rock skinned itself around flesh. Imagine a candy apple, only upside down and evil. The lava, briefly stilled by water, draped the shape of the body, hips, belly, shoulders, setting a stony coat while the rest of the flow piled and thickened behind it. The pool became a blister in the moving rock. Inside the new shell, the rhino did what dead things do. It came apart. Heat drove off water. Soft tissue collapsed and boiled. Gases built and vented. The outline sagged a little. But by then, the outside was stone sturdy enough to hold the memory of a body even as the body vanished. In time, the last of the flesh was gone. What remained was a hollow rhino-sized negative, the animal's absence preserved by the very lava that erased it. Millions of years later, wind and frost and occasional floods set to work. Basalt is tough, but not immortal. Cracks widened. Slabs fell. A cliff face opened like a page being turned. And there, halfway up, the cavity split. What had once been a sealed capsule, the perfect mold of a dead rhino, was cut like a loaf of bread. One half peeled away. The other half waited, exposed to light for the first time since it hardened. Hikers found it. Scientists measured it. And anyone with a sense of humor took photos of themselves standing in the outline, arms out, grinning like kids. That's the thing about the Rhino Cave. It's science. Yes, but it's also delight. It takes the idea of a fossil, something small, fragile, locked behind glass, and flips it. Here, the fossil is the room you're standing in. The specimen is air. If you've ever seen the body casts of Pompeii, you already know this trick of nature. Turn a life into a void, then pour stone around it. Pompeii's casts were made by archaeologists who filled ash cavities with plaster to reveal the shapes of people. The Columbia Basin did the same favor without our help. Lava was the plaster. The rhino was the mold. And erosion was the museum attendant who finally pulled back the curtain. There's a satisfying logic to the details. 2. The cavity shows the animal upside down, exactly how a bloated carcass floats. The legs are drawn up tight. The chest is broad. Even the suggestion of paired horns fits the two-horned Dinosaurs profile. Down to the pose. The physics behaves like a true story should. What I love about this death, if one can love a death, is how it rewrites the list of things that scare you. Predators. Sure. Drought and disease. Of course. But becoming architecture? That's new. One unlucky afternoon, a rhinoceros went from citizen to structure, from body to room. And it happened not in some fantastical myth, but in a place you can drive to, park near, and visit on a windy day when the basalt smells like sun-baked iron. It's also a reminder that catastrophe and creativity often share a border. The same lava flows that killed and entombed turned the Northwest into a geologic wonder: pillars, hexagonal columns, organ-pipe cliffs. The same heat that ruined a life preserved its outline. Destruction, meet memory, stand there long enough, inside that stony silhouette, and the scene reconstructs itself whether you want it to or not. You hear the lazy lap of water against reeds. You feel the hush of a big animal's breathing that has finally stopped. You sense the air thickening as heat rolls in. The first sharp stink of something too hot to be near. Then the pop and spit of rocks skinning over water. A lid settling. A hiss fading to a low subterranean heartbeat as the hollow seals. The rest is patience and time. Erosion is just a storyteller with a slow voice. There's a practical lesson tucked in the strangeness. 2. We tend to imagine fossils as bones and shells, the hard odds and ends of bodies. But the record is wider than that. Sometimes it captures behavior's footprints, burrows, nests. Sometimes it keeps disasters: mudslides, ashfalls, sudden floods, and the awkward positions living things take when they meet them. And sometimes, just sometimes, it keeps a shape, an outline, the negative of a life. Enough to say, something stood here, something heavy, something that breathed and ate and blundered through a bad moment into geology. The Rhino Cave is that kind of sentence carved in stone. It says, this is the space where a body used to be. And after a chapter about a rhinoceros turned into a room, you might think we've reached peak weird. But the fossil record has a way of one-upping us. Because our next story leaves the lava fields and the coulees behind and heads to East Africa, where a different kind of absence waits in the ground. Not the outline of an animal, but the scattered bones of a family, more than a dozen of our distant relatives who died together in a place we still call by its catalog number. They're known as AL 333, the first family. And the question that haunts their resting place is as simple as any true crime mystery. What happened to them? Some fossil sites feel like accidents: one unlucky animal trapped in tar, one bird struck down mid-flight. But sometimes, the ground offers up something far rarer: a group, a gathering, a moment frozen where many lives ended together. And among all the strange mass deaths locked in stone, few strike closer to home than one discovered in the Afar Triangle of Ethiopia. Its label is Clinical AL 333, but the nickname scientists gave it is much more intimate. They call it the first family. The first family belonged not to dinosaurs, not to sloths, not to rhinos, but to Australopithecus afarensis, own distant relatives. The same species as the famous skeleton Lucy. Small, upright apes who walked on two legs. 3 million years ago, across the savannas of East Africa, they were about 3.5 feet tall, with long arms for climbing, brains a third the size of ours, and lives spent foraging, fending off predators, and raising young. Not quite human, not quite ape, somewhere in between. When paleoanthropologists stumbled onto AL 333 in the 1970s, what they found was astonishing. The remains of at least 17 individuals, all in one place. Adults, adolescents, children, a cross-section of ages. Like a family snapshot where everyone happened to be present. Except this snapshot was taken at the moment of death. It's hard to overstate how unusual that is. Fossil hominins are almost always solitary: one jawbone here, a skull there, the fragment of a femur half a mile away. But here were nearly 20 of them, clustered together, buried at the same time. A tragedy preserved in bulk. And immediately, the mystery loomed. What happened? The first guess was familiar: a flash flood. African landscapes are notorious for sudden, violent downpours that turn dry gullies into rivers. Perhaps a flood swept the group away, tumbling them into a channel where sediment buried them. For years, this was the leading idea. But sediment analysis told another story. The surrounding soils didn't show flood deposits. No telltale layering of silt. No chaotic jumble of water-sorted bones. The flood theory began to crack. If not water, then what? Some pointed to predators. Africa, then as now, was full of killers. Saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, packs of carnivores that could ambush and overwhelm even a group of bipeds. And predators sometimes surplus skill, taking down more than they can eat, leaving carcasses scattered. Could AL-333 have been the aftermath of such an attack? The missing bones offered tantalizing hints. Many of the skeletons were incomplete, with small elements like finger bones and toe bones gone. Modern cats often chew away the ends of carcasses, eating the softer bits, swallowing small bones for calcium. Maybe the same thing happened here. The idea fits a predator attack neatly enough. Picture it. A group of Australopithecus gathered on a savanna edge. Perhaps they came to a watering hole. Perhaps they foraged together. Then shadows appear, sleek cats, or a pack of giant hyenas. Panic erupts. The hunters strike. Chaos. Screams. Claws. One by one, the apes fall. Hours later, the predators leave. Bellies full. Bones scattered. Time and dust finish the burial. 3 million years later, we find them. But there's a problem. No bite marks. No clear tooth grooves. And while missing bones suggest scavengers, the evidence isn't decisive. So paleontologists keep the predator theory on the table, but with a question mark. Then came another, stranger possibility: poisoning. Food poisoning. To be precise, plants, after all, can kill just as effectively as fangs. Eat the wrong tuber, chew the wrong leaf, and alkaloids shut down your organs. Entire herds of animals sometimes die this way. Could the first family have foraged together, feasted on something toxic, and all collapsed near the same spot? It sounds plausible until you remember these were vegetarians used to their environment. It would take a very unusual plant, or very bad luck, to kill 17 at once. And again, the bones show no direct evidence. No lesions. No chemical traces. Just an eerie absence. Which leaves us in a gray zone. 17 of our distant kin, dead together. Their cause unknown. And here's where the story takes on a human edge. Because it's not just about bones. It's about people. Standing at AL-333. You can't help but picture them as a family group. Maybe huddled for safety. Maybe gathered for food. Children clinging to mothers. Adolescents jostling for attention. Adults scanning the horizon for danger. Their final moments, whatever the cause, weren't just animal deaths. They were moments in our own lineage. A page torn out of our family album. It feels hauntingly like a crime scene without a culprit. Every hypothesis leaves traces of doubt. Predator? Possible, but unproven. Poison? Maybe, but unlikely. Flood? Once favored, now discarded. In the end, all we know for certain is that they died together. Suddenly, in a way rare enough to shock even veteran scientists. And maybe that's why the nickname stuck. The first family. Not because they were literally the first, but because their deaths bring us closer to them than most fossils ever do. Not a lone jawbone. Not a solitary skull. But a group like us. A family lost in an accident 3 million years ago, leaving us with questions we'll probably never answer. There's an intimacy to that mystery. You don't just study these bones. You feel them. Because if 17 Australopithecus could vanish in one stroke, what does that say about fragility? About chance? About the razor-thin line that separates survival from extinction? And perhaps that's the point. Fossils don't just tell us how life lived. They tell us how it ended. Sometimes in ways we can explain. Sometimes in ways we can't. But if AL-333 leaves us with unanswered questions, our next story offers something much clearer and stranger. Because if it's bizarre to imagine a family wiped out by mystery, it's downright surreal to imagine fish being killed by squid, or more precisely, by dead squid turning into weapons. And yet, that's exactly what paleontologists uncovered in the seas of the Jurassic. Of all the weird deaths captured in stone, this one might be my personal favorite, because it sounds like something out of slapstick comedy. Fish, killed not by predators, not by disease, not even by the asteroid apocalypse, but by squid. Dead squid. To be precise, squid that had already checked out, floating belly up, and somehow managed to take their killers with them. Our story takes place in the Jurassic, about 180 million years ago, in oceans that swarmed with ammonites, ichthyosaurs, and schools of fish that would look almost familiar today. Among those fish was Tharsis, a modest-sized bony fish that mostly fed on small scraps bits of soft tissue, algae, whatever it could scavenge. Harmless, middle of the food chain. And swimming alongside them were the belemnites. Think of them as ancient cousins of squid long, torpedo-shaped animals with a hard internal shell called a rostrum. If you've ever seen a bullet-shaped fossil the size of your finger, that's a belemnite rostrum. Sleek, aerodynamic, almost weapon-like in design. Now here's where things get strange. Paleontologists started finding fossils where Tharsis and belemnites weren't just next to each other, they were fused together. Over and over. The same bizarre pose, a fish with a belemnite rostrum jammed straight into its throat or even out through its gills. Not one specimen. Not two. Dozens. Enough that scientists realized this wasn't a fluke. Something weird was going on in the Jurassic seas. At first, theories ran wild. Was this predation? Maybe the belemnites, armed with their sharp rostra, rammed the fish like underwater torpedoes. But that didn't fit. Belemnites were fast. Yes, but not built for kamikaze attacks. Their bodies were soft, fragile. Impaling a fish with their own shells would have been like stabbing someone with your backbone. Not exactly a winning strategy. Could it be the fish attacking the squid instead? Not likely. Tharsis wasn't a predator of big prey. It ate tiny things. Chasing down and swallowing a squid half its size would have been like you deciding to gulp down a cat. No evidence for that either. For decades, nobody could quite explain these strange death embraces until someone took a closer look at the belemnites themselves. Many of the rostra showed signs of incrustation barnacles, bivalves, little organisms that only grow on things that have been floating dead for a while. That was the clue. These squid weren't alive when they skewered the fish. They were already corpses. Here's the most likely scenario. A belemnite dies. Its soft body rots away, leaving the hard rostrum. Because the shell is gas-filled, it floats, like a balloon with a sharp spike at one end. Slowly, it drifts to the surface, rolling with the waves. Enter Tharsis. These fish had a habit of sucking on floating debris at the water's surface, picking off edible scraps. A floating belemnite, stripped of its flesh but still carrying a whiff of organic residue, would have looked like a tempting snack. So the fish goes in for a nibble. The rostrum, sleek and pointed, slides into its open mouth. Maybe the fish panics, thrashes, tries to spit it out. But instead of coming free, the spike angles backward, sliding deeper, until it lodges in the gills. Now the fish can't close its mouth, can't dislodge the spear. Water flow stops. Breathing stops. The fish suffocates, impaled not by a predator, but by a corpse drifting like a deadly booby trap. It's morbid, it's tragic, and it's hilarious, in the way only nature can be. Death by roadkill, Jurassic Edition. And remember, this didn't just happen once. Fossils keep turning up showing the same story, fish after fish, stuck with squid shells in their throats. It was common enough that paleontologists now consider it a recurring hazard of the Jurassic oceans. Imagine being a fish back then. You had to watch out for predators. Sure, but also for dead squid floating around, waiting to stab you in the face. There's something almost cartoonish about it. You can practically imagine a Looney Tunes sketch, a fish humming along, minding its business, only to choke on a floating spear like a cosmic joke. It's the kind of death that feels too ridiculous to be real, except the fossils prove otherwise. And what I love most about this case is what it says about the fossil record itself. We tend to imagine fossils as solemn things, reminders of ancient majesty, but they also capture comedy, bad timing, dumb luck, stories that make us laugh even as we shake our heads. The Jurassic fish and their squid spears remind us that extinction doesn't always come with drama. Sometimes it comes with slapstick, and that in the long sweep of history, life has always been vulnerable not just to predators and catastrophes, but to accidents, Random, absurd, unfair accidents. So by the time we add this to our growing list, we have sloths who poison themselves with their own waste, frogs who drowned in their own mating frenzy, a pterosaur killed by a yucca leaf, dinosaurs and fish destroyed by glass rain from an asteroid, rhinos roasted in pyroclastic flows, or turned into caves by lava, and now fish skewered by squid corpses. It's a museum of the bizarre, a catalog of absurdity. And maybe that's why these fossils resonate so deeply, because they feel familiar. They remind us that life has always been unpredictable, fragile, and sometimes just plain ridiculous. Whether you're a 4-ton sloth or a small Jurassic fish, nature has a million ways to take you out and not all of them make sense. So the next time you're having a rough day, take comfort in this. At least you're not a fish with a squid stuck in your throat. When you put all these stories side by side, you start to notice a pattern. Not a scientific one exactly, but an emotional one. Because yes, each of these fossils teaches us something about biology, geology, and deep time, but they also reveal something stranger, something more human. The universe doesn't always play by rules of fairness or dignity. Think back to Tanque Loma in Ecuador. Dozens of elephant-sized sloths, buried not by predators or tar, but by their own bathroom habits, for tons of muscle and bone, humbled by microbes in a pool of contaminated water. It's tragic, yes, but it's also slapstick. The prehistoric equivalent of slipping on a banana peel. Then the Geiseltal frogs, hundreds of them, drowned not in a plague or drought, but in the chaos of their own mating season. Overexcited males piling on, exhausted females dragged under. It sounds like a cruel joke, except the fossils prove it was real. Even passion, it seems, carries risks when the stakes are survival. And then the pterosaur, a king of the skies, with wings wide enough to blot out the sun, reduced to a pitiful, starving husk because it flew face first into a yucca leaf. A plant, the same kind of spiky landscaping bush you might walk past in Arizona without a second thought, to survive millions of years of evolution, only to lose to a shrub that's irony you can't make up. Tanis in North Dakota shows us another side. The asteroid that ended the age of dinosaurs didn't just kill spectacularly at ground zero. It killed weirdly, thousands of miles away. Fish choking on glass rain. Turtles impaled by trees hurled like javelins. Dinosaurs crushed not by fangs, but by skyscraper-high waves. These aren't grand Hollywood deaths. They're random, ugly accidents. And yet, they changed the course of history. Without them, mammals wouldn't have risen. Without them, we wouldn't be here. The Cappadocia rhino shows us that sometimes nature doesn't just kill, it cooks. A 2-ton beast, roasted alive in a pyroclastic surge. Its skull brittle as if it had been microwaved. Horrific, but also proof that volcanoes don't discriminate. Pompeii or prehistoric plains. The method is the same. The Washington Rhino Cave takes absurdity to architectural levels. An animal so unlucky it died in a lava flow. And so lucky that its body created a natural mold, a hollow you can literally step inside today. It's not just a fossil. It's a room. One unlucky afternoon, a rhino went from being an animal to being negative space in a cliff. Nature is sculptor, using death as her chisel. And then AL 333, the first family. 17 of our distant relatives, Australopithecus afarensis, dead together. A tragedy not of comedy, but of mystery. We don't know if they were killed by predators, poisoned, or struck down by some accident. All we know is that they died side by side. Their bones whisper of vulnerability, of the thin line that separates survival from extinction. It's less funny than frogs or sloths, but it's more haunting, because this time, the victims looked a little like us. Finally, the Jurassic fish and their Squid-Spears. Perhaps the most absurd of all. Dozens of fish, suffocated not by predators, but by dead belemnites drifting like spiked balloons. Death by floating corpses. It's the kind of story you'd laugh off as too far-fetched if not for the fossils lined up in museum drawers. Each one a reminder that yes, this really happened. So what do we do with all of this? What's the takeaway from a sloth in a septic tank? A frog in a love pile? A pterosaur versus a yucca, or a fish with a squid in its throat. I think the lesson is twofold. First, that life has always been fragile, and death has always been unpredictable. We like to think of nature as majestic, orderly, ruled by survival of the fittest. But just as often, survival is ruled by survival of the luckiest. One bad drought, one unlucky plant, one floating squid shell, and even the strongest can fall. And second, that there's humor in the fossil record. Not disrespectful laughter, but the kind of laughter that comes from recognizing absurdity. Because if sloths can die of poop, and frogs can die of too much love, then maybe our own clumsy misfortunes aren't so embarrassing after all. The fossil record isn't just a museum of tragedy. It's a comedy club too. In a strange way, these bizarre deaths make the ancient world feel closer. It's one thing to imagine towering dinosaurs battling to the death. That feels like myth, like cinema. But a pterosaur skewered by a leaf? That feels real, relatable. It reminds us that nature has always been messy, random, and occasionally ridiculous. The same unpredictability that humbles us today stubbed toes. Freak accidents. Bad luck was humbling life long before we existed. And that, to me, is comforting. Because it means that chaos isn't new. It's baked into the fabric of existence. We can't escape it. We can only laugh, adapt, and carry on. So the next time you're having a bad day, missed the bus, spilled your coffee, tripped on the sidewalk, just remember, at least you're not a giant sloth marinating in sewage. Or a fish with a squid stuck in your throat. Things could always be worse. Thanks for joining me on this tour of the strangest graveyards in Earth's history. From the absurd to the tragic, from the comic to the cosmic. The fossil record reminds us that life's endings are as varied as life itself. And no matter how mighty you think you are, sloth, frog, rhino, or human Mother Nature, chance and dumb luck will always find a way to keep us humble. Until next time.